Let's follow up our discussion on security policies with a deep dive into trusted profiles and minimum OS requirements in TwinGate, which really means that we're going to explore one of the questions that resource policies answer, and that question is, what should be true of the device a user is connecting from in a policy? So we're going to explore that and what that actually means in practice. Now, let's start with a practical aspect first. So if we go back to policies and take a look at the policy we previously defined here, we explained the authentication requirements, we explained the reauth period, we explained the MFA requirement as well. And we briefly went over device security and its three options here, but we haven't explored them a lot, and that is what we're going to do. Let's focus on what the first two mean here. So if you have a policy that is configured to allow any device in, it means that all the devices that are trying to establish connection to the resource that is behind the policy are going to be allowed in as long as they fulfill minimum OS requirements or have a trusted profile. But what does that mean and where does that live? You could just click on minimum OS requirements and it'll take you to the page. Other than that, you can go to devices, and the security tab is what covers trusted profiles and minimum OS requirements as well. Now let's actually open a second tab so we can compare and go back to our policy itself that's defined for any device, and it says must meet minimum OS requirements and have a trusted or have a trusted profile. We see trusted profiles up here. We're going to just delete this for now and have nothing in trusted profile, which means that for a device to be able to fulfill the policy, the device is going to have to abide by what is in minimum OS requirements. Now, one thing to know about minimum OS requirements is that for a device to fulfill those, the device that does not need to be verified. This is the minimum OS requirements here implies that the device isn't verified by an EDR like a CrowdStrike, a SentinelOne, or even by TwinGate itself with its native capabilities. So theoretically, for me to satisfy this policy, which remember protects my resource for what's my IP right here, or actually let me put this on this policy. For this to work, I just need to meet minimum OS requirements. I happen to be on a Mac, and so if I take a look at the minimum OS requirements tab for the Mac, it means that I am actually required to have nothing on my computer that's activated. But I'm going to go ahead and enable a check for screen lock, biometric configuration, and hard drive encryption. Let's confirm that. So this means that as per the policy definition I have here, as long as my computer, my Mac, even if it's not verified, which it's not if I take a look at the list of devices here, my Mac is not verified. We will do that later. It means that I should have access to the resource for what's my IP as long as my Mac satisfies those requirements. Now, I'm still connected to my client, which is great. Let me open another tab and go to what's my IP. Now, that is going to require MFA because remember the policy we built requires MFA, so I'm going to fulfill the MFA requirement here. And as soon as I do that, I'm on. Now, obviously, this is how it should work, but let's now change the policy and go to our 6-hour MFA verification policy, and we're going to change it from any device to only trusted devices. Now, here it's warning you that there's no trusted profile, and that's okay. We're going to create that later. But if my policy requires me to have a trusted device, then it means that I'm going to be blocked. So let's try that. So I'm trying to connect It's still asking me for multi-factor authentication because that's what's specified in the policy. If I fulfill that, this time around I get a macOS device blocked. Because macOS is blocked in this configuration, simply because I don't have, again, under device and security, I don't have a trusted profile for Mac, which means that the requirement for my device to be verified is not present, and therefore I get a block page. Now, what I would do as a user is I could just open this and send it to the admin for my account so that they can unblock me in case it's an unreasonable blocking of my device, but this is how it works. Yeah, so what do I do if I'm a TwinGate administrator and I only want people to be able to connect to my resources if they have a verified device? So the policy piece of that is already built because we've already specified that our policy requires trusted profiles. So now we're going to create a trusted profile. Trusted profiles are always specific to operating systems. In this case, I want to allow my macOS devices that are verified access. And assuming I don't have any Windows, any Linux, Android, or iOS, I'm just going to stick to macOS. So let's create a profile for macOS. We'll call it Managed macOS. And then we have to determine two things here. The first thing is we have to determine what do we actually consider a verification for a device? The question you should ask yourself here is, do you have CrowdStrike, Intune, Jamf, Conjur, or SentinelOne? If so, consider delegating the verification process to one of those by simply connecting it. So if you click on connect, you're taken to the admin console settings and you can actually integrate your EDR to TwinGate and delegate the verification to it. Let me go back here. Managed macOS. If you don't have an EDR, or if you want to rely on both the EDR and TwinGate's native device verification, just toggle manual trust to on. It is on by default here. Now, the one subtlety to remember is that if you select more than one method here, it's a logical end. So if you were to connect CrowdStrike and select CrowdStrike on top of manual verification, a manual trust, it would mean that the device needs to be known to CrowdStrike and also verified by TwinGates. It's not an or. Once you figured out how you want to define verification of devices in your environment, the second thing you should ask yourself is, are you going to check for things on the device itself? Is it enough that the device is verified? Or would you want the device to also implement screen lock, biometric configuration, so on and so forth? So I'm going to add on top of manual verification requirements for screen lock and biometric verification here. If I create my trusted profile, now in theory, this particular policy should be something that I can fulfill because only trusted devices are allowed, but I have a trusted profile for my Mac. And my Mac, as we know, already implements screen locks and biometrics. Now, if as most customers do, I'm going to actually prevent all devices from connecting to my environment if they're not verified. So I'm actually going to block all operating systems here. Blocking operating systems here doesn't mean that people don't have access to anything. It just means that devices that are not verified don't have access to anything. That's what it means. Now, let's try again to see if I have access to what's my IP. So let's start by connecting to my client again. This time I'm blocked because my device isn't verified, which makes sense because I'm trying to access a resource, trying to access something that is protected behind device verification. So again, same thing. You can click troubleshoot here and send it to an admin for troubleshooting. But in this case, it's simply because my device wasn't verified. Now remember that in the policy we picked, we only allow trusted devices. And in my trusted profile for the operating system that corresponds to my own device, which is a Mac OS, I selected manual trust. That means that I need to get my device trusted by TwinGate in the native way here. So if I click on my device, under the device lists and click verify device. You can verify its serial number. Now it shows up with a little blue mark. And if I go back and I try to connect again, I can now connect to my tenant again. I'm connected and I should be able to connect to what's my IP. Again, it's protected behind the MFA policy. So let's fulfill that. And once it's done, because my device is verified, so the device verification piece of my policy is fulfilled as well, I can access the resource as well. That's really the short version of how the policies work, right? So if you think about how they're divided into the device security screen, think of them as almost like wristbands that are required for you to access something. The minimum OS requirements never implies any device verification, whether it's through TwinGate or through your EDR. The minimum OS requirements, if they're active and required by some policies, they can be made so that they check for specific device posture checks, making sure you have a screen lock, a firewall, antivirus, and stuff like that. But they don't imply any device verification. Trusted profiles can be made to verify the same things about your devices, right? The fact that there's a screen lock, firewall, and all that. But a trusted profile implies that your device has been verified in some way, and the device verification can be done via a native mechanism in TwinGate or via an EDR, actually, or both. You could choose to have profiles that are going to require an EDR verification, like for instance, profiles that are going to allow your own employees on managed devices to connect to resources, but you can also have profiles that are going to only implement native verification that you could then implement for employees or contractors that don't have devices that are provided by your company. Right, so you can be quite flexible in how you create trusted profiles and minimum OS requirements. Now, the manual verification again, and versus EDR verification. EDR verification, all you need to do is you need to connect your EDR to the admin console once and for all, and then you can select the EDR and your trusted profiles, and or you can rely on manual verification, which is most likely going to be serial number verification. It works best for verification in TwinGate. Now, one thing that we didn't see yet, but that's in the interface, if you go and check any device actually from the device screen, you can take a look at some information from a device, whether the device has been trusted or not, how it's been verified, the version of the client that's running on the device, operating system, and a few pieces of information on the operating system here. But you can also see what trusted profiles your device actually fulfilled and what device posture checks your device actually implements. That is, even if they're not actually required, right? So in this case, firewall enabled is not required by my profiles, but it's available. And that's why the check mark here is, it's just not required. And so that's the information that you're looking at here. Now, there's a couple of other things that we haven't seen or that you might have caught in passing in the interface. The first one is if you go to policies, you have resource policies here, but you also have minimum authentication requirements. So what is the minimum authentication requirements? The minimum authentication requirements is a requirement that needs to be fulfilled only for a user to provide, to get into TwinGate. In my case here, I have authentication requirements, minimum authentication requirements set to 31 days, and I don't require MFA. So let me disconnect for a sec. And let me activate the MFA requirement. Actually, let's not do that. Let's connect back to my tenant. If I connect to the tenant, given my minimum authentication requirements, I can actually get in without providing MFA, and I can see the list of resources I'm entitled. But if I were to change the minimum authentication requirements to requiring multi-factor authentication, and I want to disconnect and connect again, now my connection to the tenant itself will require multi-factor authentication. So providing my credentials will not be enough. And so if I fulfill this, I will be back in a state where I can see my resources. So it's really the minimum authentication requirements do not give you access to any resource per se, because resource policies need to be fulfilled for your resources on top of the minimum authentication requirement. The minimum authentication requirement, therefore, really only gates access to TwinGate itself and the list of resources in your clients. So we typically advise customers to keep it fairly lengthy and not to require MFA unless you want to require MFA for absolutely everything. That's one policy. The second policy that's worth highlighting, but that's only ever impacting the administrators, is the admin console security policy, which is set to every hour. And the only thing you can change here is whether you want to require multi-factor authentication from administrators when accessing this console. It doesn't impact any other traffic beyond the admin console access. Now, minimum authentication requirements obviously need to be passed for every device at any point in time. That's a minimum. So it's important to remember that. Let's tie all of that back to the policies themselves, right? We talked about how if you create a policy and you define the policy as requiring any device, then the device will need to fulfill minimum OS requirements that don't require trust, that don't need to be verified. So if your minimum OS requirements require biometrics and that's it, the device that can get in will have to have biometrics implemented, but will not need to be verified by TwinGate. Inversely, if you select only trusted devices, the devices that are going to have access to things are going to be the devices that are trusted or verified by TwinGate, whether that is through native verification and or EDR verification. What if you want to do both though? What if you want a policy to allow access to a particular resource, but for some operating systems, you're okay with devices that are not verified, and for some other operating systems, you want devices that are verified? That's where custom comes in. If you select the third option in the policy, if you select custom, then you can actually handpick which trusted profiles are going to be let in. It's no longer a question of any trusted profiles like it is with only trusted devices. You get to select which one, and you get to select which minimum OS requirements. So you could have a policy that will allow macOS and Windows in if they are verified, but will be also letting in mobile devices like iOS and Android, for instance, even if they're not verified, as long as they have some type of posture checks. Right? You can pick custom if you want to fine-tune what controls, what your policy is going to be looking for in terms of devices. Let's talk about best practices a little bit, because I think that's always interesting to highlight. And let's talk about actual use cases that we see customers implement. The first one is if you want to require that all your devices are verified, and there is no exception to that rule, the only thing you need to do is you're going to go and block all operating systems from minimum OS requirements, because this will effectively prevent any unverified devices from accessing anything, even if a policy is misconfigured. And you're going to then create trusted profiles, as many trusted profiles as you allow operating systems in your environment, at least. So if your employees have, for instance, they have macOS and Windows, but there's no Linux, then create at a minimum a macOS profile and a Windows profile. That's what you need to do. And you need to then pick the right verification method for you for those operating systems. If you want to do the opposite of that, if you want all devices to be able to connect, but you want to do some posture checks on those devices, but they don't need to be verified, then don't create trusted profiles. just unblock the minimum OS requirements for the operating systems you expect to be able to connect to your environment, and select which device posture checks for those operating systems that are active you want to apply to those devices. And again, if you want to do a mix of both, then it's a question of creating both, right? Like, what operating systems do you want to let in that are not going to be verified and then block the rest? What operating systems do you want to let in that are verified? Create one trusted profile per. Pick the verification method for both trusted profiles and minimum OS requirements. Pick what device posture checks you want to implement, and off you go. The last thing to cover is our recommendation for best practices in terms of the naming convention of your resources. The resources in TwinGate in the admin console are everywhere. Right? So if you take a look at, say, your list of resources, you, for instance, have the option to add a column for the primary resource policy of those resources. You can also see, if you go to any of my resources, the primary policy, but then the secondary or override policies for other groups. Having a good naming convention here is really interesting, because since policies are everywhere in TwinGates, if your naming convention is clear and reflective of what the policy implements, then you don't have to go back and forth and open policies. All you need to do is just name it the right way, and then it becomes immediately visible what is it that they mean. Right? So if I go back and add this again here, this is immediately clear what needs to be fulfilled for each resource in my environment. So the typical naming convention we recommend, although any naming convention will do as long as it satisfies your business needs, is to specify whether a policy will require authentication. And if it does require authentication, how often is the user going to reauth? It's between an hour and 30 or 31 days. So we recommend encoding it like this. Does the policy require MFA or no MFA? And does the policy let in all devices, only verified devices, or something custom? And that's the part that you can maybe customize a little bit more depending on what you have and how much information you want your policy names to contain. But having that in the platform is interesting, because then you will see it everywhere. And even if you start automating things and using the command line interface with the API, then having the name of your policy be reflective of its contents, it's just going to save you a lot of memorization.